Hello, this is Marc here at Garrett's Guitars in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I'm going to talk today, this is Tube Talk Part 2. We're going to talk about the 12AX7 family of tubes and use that as a way to talk about tube crossing. So tube crossing is kind of what it sounds like. It's when you can take a different tube and plug it in the same socket. There are what we call direct crosses, which are, for example, we talked about the ECC 83 and the 12AX7, which are essentially the same tube, made in different factories. Standards may be slightly different, but they're supposed to do the same thing, and they're interchangeable 99% of the time. Then there's tubes, then there's crosses that are indirect, where the tube will fit in the socket, all the pins match up, but it's a different tube. We'll talk about that too. But let's talk about the 12AX7 family of tubes. So anything that begins with a 12 and ends with a 7, anything, most anything, because I don't want to get into absolutes here, they cross. And so you have the 12DW7, the 12AY7, the 12AT7, and they have different gain characteristics essentially. You sometimes will these are indirect crosses, so that they're not exactly the same tube, but they'll fit in the socket, they'll work in the circuit. And sometimes we swap these tubes to change the gain characteristics of an amplifier. For example, if you're like, oh man, my power tubes are just working too hard, the signal's getting to them, and I get distortion too soon, I want to be able to turn my amp up to 5 without getting distortion, instead of turn up to 4. And it's like, well, what's the phase splitter in that amp? And if the phase splitter is a 12AX, maybe put it in a 12AT, step down the gain a little bit, step down the gain going to the tubes. If you don't know about this tube stuff, then maybe I just blew your mind a little with phase splitter. Phase inverter, actually, I should say. But that's a whole other video. The point I wanted to make is the 12AX7 family of tubes can be interchangeable, and you can get interesting results. We have customers, especially in some very common amps, the Blues Junior, sometimes in a preamp, sometimes even studio preamps if it has a 12AX7 in it, especially if it's a high gain 12AX7. Some people like to swap in an AT or an AY and get a little less gain out of it, get a little more clarity. Also, you can soup up an amp a little bit. If there's a 12AT and you throw in a 12AX, it does essentially the opposite. So, that's the introduction to tube crossing. There are cross-reference manuals. I have the one that I photocopied from my uncle 30-something years ago. And because they were just so hard to get, there was, back in my day, we didn't have the internet. You could just Google it. So, it was hard to actually, sometimes it was hard to get these, and we didn't have eBay, you couldn't go buy them used or Amazon used or anything. So we actually, if someone had a tube reference manual, some people would photocopy them. And so I have a photocopied version of the tube manual. But tube manuals are readily available on the internet, and then also tube cross-reference is part of the tube manual. Let's talk about more crossing. And I brought a visual aid. This here is a 6L6, and this is a 6V6. Now these are also an indirect cross. They're both a similar tube with the same pinout, but they have different requirements for voltages. And so what it works is the 6L6 can go into a 6V6 socket. The 6V6 has a lower plate voltage. So the 6L6 will be in the 6V6 socket, and it would just be like just hardly working. It's like it never hurts to put super gas in your car, put the higher octane. Well, that's a good point, because sometimes cars don't like the higher octane. And sometimes amps don't like the 6L6 in place of 6V6. A lot of people like the 6V6 for its warmth. It's definitely considered a warm. So this is the Champ tube or the Deluxe Princeton. These are all these amps are very sought after these days. They're low wattage. The 636, a single 636 can put out 6 watts, kind of. And wattage is another video. But let's just say a single 6L6 can put out maybe twice that. So now will your amp be twice as loud? No. The 6L6 will just work in the 6v6 socket with different characteristics. But because you're putting less voltage to it, getting less result out of it, your wattage will be minimally changed. Once again, this is something if you're like, oh, I got this amp, I just hate the sound. You can switch in the 6L6s and see what it sounds like. But putting a 6V6 in a 6L6 socket is pretty much a no-no, because the voltages will be too high. The tube will be overworked, and it will work in a pinch. I think I've done it in a pinch. You know, if you got a gig, you're like, damn. But not advised. Don't do that. So we covered crossing. So a lot of tubes have crosses, and some of these crosses can be done to make things more interesting, change characteristics slightly. It can be fun and interesting. So I think that's enough about crosses. I told you about the 12AX7 family, the 6L6. That should do it for now. I'm going to make a bunch of these videos, I think, because as I start to explain these things, other things come up, like phase inverter and stuff that I also want to tell you about. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and watch the video before this, which is tube test part 1. Watch the video after this, if I made it yet, and that's tube test part 3. Not tube test, that's another guy. Tube talk. Part 3. I do recommend tube test, by the way. If you look for that guy on that's Johnny. If you look for him on YouTube, he's a avid YouTuber, and mostly talking about microphone tubes, but really interesting stuff. So that should do it for now. Thanks for watching.